Hello, everyone. I'm Renad Betis. I'm an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Primary and Secondary Prevention Risk Assessment Intervention Evaluation Flash Science session. Thanks for joining us today. We're so glad that you're here. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. The chat is disabled, so please do use the Q&A feature for all questions. If you have a question for our presenters, please ask it by typing in the Q&A feature in your bottom menu bar at any time. And we're going to ask you to wait for the Q&A until after all the abstracts have been presented. However, send in your questions throughout the session so you don't forget your great questions. And then we'll answer as many as we can as time allows in the discussion section. A live transcript is available for this session. If you prefer to hide the captions, please click the up arrow next to the transcript button and select hide transcript. Now, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming our fabulous abstract presenters. First, Amanda Abel, Research Data Analyst at the University of California, Davis. Then, Dr. Uzair Raja, Emergency Medicine Resident at Mercy Health in Muskegon. Third, we'll have Dr. Christopher Kanapke, Research Assistant Professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Fourth, we'll have Lauren Rooney, Research Associate with the Firearm Injury Policy and Research Program at Harborview Injury Prevention Center. Fifth, we'll have Bonnie Siri Bove, Research Assistant in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Then we'll have Tess Trinka, medical student at the Alpert Medical School at Brown University. Then we'll have Dr. Katie Hoskins, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Greg Bushman, PhD candidate at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And Dr. Rose Kagawa, assistant professor at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. Okay, so we will begin screen sharing the presentations. I'm really excited to see what everyone has to share with us and go ahead and get started.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Abel, and I'm going to be giving two brief presentations today, the first of which is about risk perceptions surrounding household firearm ownership and optimism bias. Next slide, please. So optimism bias is a phenomenon observed for many health risk behaviors, such as smoking and driving, in which people tend to underestimate their own vulnerability to risk while perceiving others in a similar situation to be more susceptible to harm. So we wanted to explore the extent to which optimism bias exists for firearm-related risks and whether it's associated with firearm ownership status and characteristics of gun owners, such as their reasons for ownership and storage practices. To do this, we used data from the first wave of our California Safety and Wellbeing Survey, and we compared participants' responses to two questions. First, would having a gun at your home make it a safer place or a more dangerous place to be? And second, if everyone in your neighborhood had guns at home, would that make your neighborhood a safer or more dangerous place to be? For each of these questions, respondents could choose safer, more dangerous, it depends, or don't know. And for this analysis, we combine the last two categories. Next. So these graphs show the percentage of respondents who said safer on the left and more dangerous on the right, stratified by gun ownership status. As expected, gun owners most often said that having a gun in the home made it safer, and least often said it was more dangerous, followed by non-owners who live with owners, and then people without guns at home. But across all groups, people were significantly more likely to say it was safer for them to have a gun in their own home than for their neighbors to have guns in their homes. And the converse was also true for more dangerous. Next. In this table, we can see how many people stayed consistent with their answers across the two questions and how many displayed optimism bias. Next. We defined optimism bias as these three response patterns and found that about 1/4 of all respondents answered in this way. Optimism bias was most common among non-owners who live with owners, and when looking at households with children, it was more prevalent among people with firearms in the home. Next. Lastly, when looking at just firearm owners, we found that there were notable differences in the prevalence of optimism bias by reasons for ownership, types of guns owned, and length of ownership, but only the reasons for ownership was statistically significant. And we did not find a difference in optimism bias by firearm storage practices. Next. I think I'm a little short on time, but I'm just gonna summarize by saying that for other health risk behaviors, people who display optimism bias are less likely to engage in protective behaviors, and accountability and insight-based interventions have shown success in reducing optimism bias, and we want to explore whether this might apply to firearm injury prevention as well. Next, please. Okay, so my next presentation is about people's exposure to individuals at risk for violence and self-harm in their social networks. And we use data from the second wave of our California Safety and Wellbeing Survey. Next, please. So research on exposure to violence largely focuses on direct victimization or witnessing violent events. So in our 2020 survey, we decided to measure some broader experiences of violence that might be considered indirect forms of exposure. One question we were interested in was how many people personally know someone at risk for violence to themselves or others? What are the specific reasons they're concerned? And what actions, if any, have they taken to reduce the risk of injury? Next, please. This is the exact question that we asked respondents, and we found that slightly more than 1 in 8 knew at least one person whom they perceived to be at risk for self-harm, and 1 in 8 knew someone at risk for other directed harm. Next. In follow-up questions, we discovered that about 16% of those at risk for self-harm and 11% of those at risk for other directed harm were under the age of 20. 23% and 12% of respondents respectively reported living with the person at risk, and about half of those respondents also had children in their household. And 11% and 19% of respondents said the person had access to a firearm, though a large proportion also said they didn't know. Next. When asked whether this person's firearm access was one of the reasons they were concerned, about half of all respondents and over half of gun owners in both cases said that it was a concern of theirs. Next. Other reasons for concern included things like the person has hurt themselves or others before, made threats of violence, has trouble with drugs or alcohol, or has experienced major loss. And the majority of respondents reported taking some action to help reduce the risk of injury, including asking for help from family or friends or talking with the person about the risk. Next. So if we extrapolate these findings, we estimate that about 4 million California adults know at least one person whom they think is at risk for harming themselves, and 3.6 million know someone at risk for harming others. This includes many people who live with someone at risk and also have children or adolescents in the home. And given what we know about ACEs, it'll be important to study the potential consequences of these broader experiences of violence. Our research also suggests that people are attuned to risk factors for harm and may be willing to intervene. So this underscores the potential utility of interventions that leverage the knowledge of those closest to someone at risk in order to prevent violence. And I've included a couple examples here that maybe we can go into later in the Q&A. So thank you.
Hello, if you guys can hear me, my name is Chris Kanofsky, and I'm here to talk about challenges and opportunities in voluntary firearm storage. I have a bunch of disclosures, none of which are relevant except to say that this project is funded by an R61 from NIMH, on which Dr. Emmy Betts is the PI at the University of Colorado. Next slide, please. So means safety, excuse me, I'm sorry. My job is to set the stage here for the following two presentations. It's almost sort of like a mini embedded meta symposium. As we all know, putting time and space between an individual at risk and highly lethal means is critical, which is just as true for adults as it is for children and youth. And while most firearm owners might prefer other methods of reducing access, including out-of-home storage with family or friends, there are a variety of circumstances under which some kind of external facility might be necessary or preferable. Colorado and Washington State were two of the first with these firearm storage maps, which you can see a couple of examples of here, with more than a dozen other states now at some phase of development. These are simple geographic representations with contact information for community-based suppliers of firearm storage, typically firearm businesses, which are seen here in red, or law enforcement agencies, which are seen here in blue. And populating the map and thereby making it a useful community resource relies upon the participation of these suppliers. And participation here means two distinct yet interrelated concepts. The first being providing for voluntary temporary storage, so actually engaging in that activity. And the second would be agreeing to be listed on the map, which means that the fact that they provide the service is now being publicly promoted. Next slide. So to understand the perspective of these two suppliers of storage, we conducted focused individual and semi-structured interviews with retailers first across Colorado and Washington state. And so as you can see here, there's a beautiful picture with some members of our research team, as well as Dick Abramson, who is a founding firearm dealer member of the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition. Some of the issues that we highlighted in these were practical issues and concerns, administrative and policy issues, and support for suicide prevention efforts broadly, as being predictive of and related to their willingness to provide temporary storage. Issues within these three categories were certainly not mutually exclusive, so we would be interested in how those issues interplay with each other with respect to interest in providing for storage. Next slide. And then finally, we conducted similar semi-structured interviews with leaders and representatives of law enforcement agencies across the two states. And while the foci of these interviews were similar, we also explored their experiences in creatively engaging with their community to affect temporary storage in the past. This was particularly pertinent to our understanding of participation in the statewide storage maps. As you'd notice that the Washington state map is populated largely with law enforcement agencies, while Colorado has a greater representation of firearm businesses. You'll hear some more in the following two presentations, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you for the introduction, Chris. Oh.
Please go to Lauren.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for the introduction of the project, Chris. I will be talking a little bit more about the retailers' perspectives that we found in these semi-structured interviews. As Chris said, funding for this project was provided by the NIH R61 grant. Next slide. So through the end of 2019 and 2020, researchers from Colorado and Washington, we contacted various retailers across each state. We were able to speak with 31 total representatives from firearm stores in both states. We spoke with managers and owners of these stores about whether or not they were listed on the map, whether or not they were able to offer temporary storage at all, and their policies and practices regarding temporary storage, as well as their general feelings about this as a potential crisis intervention tool. Next slide. Throughout these interviews, we saw that overall retailers were in favor of temporary voluntary storage as an idea and public health practice, especially when compared to more legal-based interventions such as extreme risk protection orders or other court-ordered options for storage. Where stores differed is in their ability to do so, perceptions on if it would let them, on if the law would let them, and views on firearm storage as an actual crisis prevention intervention strategy. What we found is that for those who were able to provide storage, they found different workarounds to address legal concerns to allow them to do so, such as logging the firearm storage as gunsmithing or cleaning. Many of these retailers who provided storage also spoke to the sense that they felt that this was their community duty to provide this, recognizing the risk of firearm access in crisis moments. For those who did not choose to participate in the map or offer temporary voluntary storage, a lot of them cited storage space and cost as the main concern, saying that they simply did not have the space to store firearms for people. And they were concerned with the cost of providing this as a service, especially when given smaller stores who felt that they would not be able to have the resources to provide this at all. There was also a lot of speaking on uncertainty around the legality of being able to offer this. They did not. This in and of itself was a rather gray area, meaning people didn't really know whether or not. Some felt that they were able to offer this fully legally, others did not. And some also spoke to the fact that they did not see this as a crisis intervention strategy and that it would be worthwhile. They didn't see the firearm as the concern in the crisis intervention and felt that mental health concern would be, or mental health practices would be a more appropriate concern. Next slide. As for the implications of this, we do believe it's important to communicate with stores about the various resources across the state, even in places where they may not be able to provide storage or they are not able to physically have storage on site, making sure that they're aware of the map as a tool. We also think that it's important to provide clear and concise messaging about the legal parameters of offering temporary storage and ensure that they feel that they are legally protected to offer this. And we also believe that it would be important to support policies that would permit temporary voluntary storage by firearm retailers. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Bonnie Siribovi. I'm focusing on the same project, voluntary firearm storage, from the perspective of law enforcement agencies. So this is a piece of the Gun Back project shared by Chris and Lauren. Next, please. Thank you. Temporary firearm storage is a safe and practical way to get firearms out of the home when someone's at risk of suicide. Here we explore the views of law enforcement officials on storage and their interest in participating in our firearm map, both with the goal of broadly helping to connect individuals at risk of suicide to firearm storage resources. We spoke with 17 law enforcement representatives from both Colorado and Washington State last year, and we used thematic analysis to explore the ideas that were shared. Next, please. What we learned: there are practical concerns, as we saw with retailers, 3 of which are the availability of space to store guns, the cost of storing guns from financial sense, including time and effort of employees, and background checks, who runs them, when to run them, and how to pay for them. There are also social and political challenges. Law enforcement officials we spoke with recognize that community members may not view law enforcement agencies as their first choice for temporary voluntary firearm storage for reasons described as a lack of trust. But with that, law enforcement officials saw it as within their purview to provide this service as part of their role in the community, and if unable to provide the service themselves, be educated to still serve the community need. As such, law enforcement felt they could be a stepping stone to connect gun retailers and ranges who could provide this service to individuals seeking storage. Next, please. Implications for public health. Like we said before, there's a need for communication, both between storage map creators to law enforcement and law enforcement to individual officers within departments, so they know what resources they're allowed to share and how they can be of service. And then further communication to the community on how law enforcement agencies can be a resource when looking for temporary voluntary firearm storage. With that, having awareness of the barriers that need to be addressed to provide temporary voluntary firearm storage for individuals at increased risk of suicide is super important. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tess Trinka. I will be presenting a project entitled Firearm Injury Bystander Interventions by 4-H Shooting Sports Leaders, a Qualitative Study. Next, please. Our project is the first part of a 3-year CDC-funded R01 grant to test a bystander intervention to prevent firearm injury in 4-H shooting sports. The goal of this first part of the project was to understand A, how 4-H shooting sports youth recognize intentional firearm injury risk within their larger community, and B, whether they feel equipped to intervene should risk present itself. To accomplish this, we conducted semi-structured interviews with a purposeful sample of adult and teen 4-H shooting sports leaders. These interviews were conducted remotely by a single interviewer, recorded, and then transcribed. Informed by the theory of planned behavior, 2 staff double-coded the data using a framework matrix and thematic analysis. Research then examined categories for both deductive and emergent themes. Next, please. 20 interviews have been completed to date with a geographically diverse sample, and 4 major themes were identified. Number 1 was that most participants identified risk situations exclusively in terms of unintentional firearm injury. Number 2, participants easily identified some injury markers, such as alcohol and depression, but not others, such as recent crisis. Number 3, intervention barriers include attitude, normative, and control beliefs, for example, fear of conflict, awareness of social implications, and lack of confidence in risk assessment. And number 4, intervention facilitators included prior firearm training and 4-H's supportive community. Next slide, please. The implications of this study, we found that 4-H shooting sports has a strong emphasis on preventing unintentional firearm injury, but additional training could help youth identify and address risk factors for intentional firearm injury in their own communities. Attitudinal, normative, and control beliefs serve as potential barriers to intervening, and facilitators such as prior firearm training and the presence of a supportive community such as 4-H were also identified. We are currently in the process of using the data to create and modify a bystander intervention. This partnership with 4-H shooting sports shows the capacity for developing cooperative youth firearm safety interventions and will directly inform our 4-H shooting sports bystander intervention. We would like to acknowledge 4-H shooting sports leadership, including Todd Kessner and Craven Hudson, as well as Affirm Research for their expertise and support throughout our project. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Katie Hoskins, and I'm delighted to present on behalf of co-authors listed here and would like to note our pilot funding by the FACTS Consortium. The study is titled A Mixed Methods Evaluation of Parents' Perspectives on the Acceptability of the Safe Firearm Program. Next slide. So as some background, using an established adaptation framework, our team adapted the firearm storage component of the Safety Check Violence Prevention Program, an evidence-based approach that includes screening, counseling, and free cable lock distribution in pediatric primary care, tested in a large RCT led by Sherry Barkin. Our adaptation expanded its reach and function as a universal suicide prevention strategy. In this study, we investigated parents' perspectives on the adapted program, now named Safe Firearm, to ensure acceptability and optimize effectiveness prior to launch of an upcoming hybrid effectiveness implementation trial. We first conducted a cross-sectional survey with a convenient sample of 97 US parents, 45 fire owners, and 52 non-owners to measure program acceptability and other key variables using established measures. Then we conducted semi-structured interviews with 11 survey respondents to gain an in-depth understanding of parents' perceptions. We used a think aloud exercise in which participants watched a video simulating safe firearm delivery, and then they paused the video at 3 pre-specified time points to provide immediate reactions to the content. Next slide. Our quantitative results indicated high program acceptability with no differences in acceptability by parents' firearm ownership status, gender, race, ethnicity, or region. Parent-doctor depth of relationship scale score and acceptability were positively correlated, suggesting that higher relationship quality, which includes perceptions of the clinician as caring, accepting, and taking parents seriously, promotes acceptability. Of firearm owners who did not always store their firearms locked, unloaded, and ammo separate, 64% agreed or completely agreed with the statement, "I would change the way firearms are stored after receiving Safe Firearm." Qualitative findings indicate that views on pediatric clinicians' role, quality of delivery, neutral messaging, and availability of tangible resources all shape acceptability. And we also learned about opportunities to enhance adaptation. Next slide. In terms of implications, end user feedback across a diverse group of parents confirms that Safe Firearm is both acceptable and ready for implementation. Our approach provided insights for pre-implementation preparation to inform trial launch. So for example, in the interviews, we heard that parents hoped for additional resources for talking about firearms with friends and family. In response, we built a website with resources and added this content. Lastly, using an established adaptation model may enhance family-centeredness of sensitive interventions through explicit integration of parents' preferences into program refinements. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gregory Bushman, and I will be presenting today about an ongoing project looking at the associations between public art and firearm violence in Detroit, Michigan. And I just want to mention that this project represents a collaboration between researchers at the Michigan School of Public Health and the School of Art and Design, and I want to thank that bigger team for their work on this. Next slide, please. So our research question going into this work was informed by a growing body of research which has demonstrated the positive effects of environmental change interventions in reducing violence. And so we hypothesized that public art may represent another type of environmental change that could have implications for youth firearm violence. And specifically, as illustrated in our conceptual model here, we hypothesize that this relationship may be mediated by community, social, environmental factors. And because of that, we also hypothesize that public art projects which engage community residents in the planning and creation of the artwork will have the greatest effects on community violence. And so to begin getting at these questions, we first worked with local artists and arts-focused organizations in Detroit to identify and create a database of 133 public artworks in the city. And then to assess changes in crime and violence around those, we integrated this data with crime data provided by the Michigan State Police. Next slide, please. So on the left side of the screen is a map showing the locations of the artworks we've identified, overlaying a kernel density raster showing the density of youth firearm violence between 2015 and 2019. And so to summarize our analyses, first we randomly sampled 500 points in the city, calculated the distance to the nearest identified public artwork in our database, and found that proximity to public artwork was negatively associated with youth firearm violence. Then we examined pre-post changes in youth firearm violence at the locations of 22 recently installed public artworks. And so these were artworks created in either 2018 or 2019. And that's because we noticed some data quality issues with our pre-2017 crime data, which we're still trying to address. But basically in this analysis, we found that youth firearm violence at public art sites had somewhat, but not significantly decreased between the year before the artwork was created and the year it was finished. And then finally, for those same 22 sites, we selected matched controls using a combination of census data and parcel data and conducted a difference in difference analysis. Again, we found that public art sites maybe had some greater reductions in youth firearm violence over time compared to controls, but these differences weren't significant. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we find some evidence that public art may be associated with crime and violence, but our current evidence is mixed. So next steps for us include addressing some of the crime data quality issues we discovered and also collecting more information about the artworks we've identified. So we're currently surveying and interviewing the artists who created these works to get more information about them, such as the exact creation date, as well as if the community residents had any involvement in the planning or the creation of the work. We're also working to pull and code Google Street View images of the public art sites to make sure that they really are comparable to make sure that the controls really are comparable to the artworks that we've identified. And then finally, down the line, we also like to collect survey data from the residents, the communities that have had public artworks created, so we can examine associations between public art and the social environmental factors that we hypothesize might mediate those relationships. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rose Kagawa, and thanks everyone for coming today. So I'm presenting work on the types of violence prevention approaches that cities are implementing. There are numerous approaches to violence prevention. Some are more effective than others. Some focus on individuals and some focus on the structural causes of violence. Some are punitive and some are restorative. And there's a lot of debate about which of these we should use to confront and prevent violence in America. So this study takes a step back to understand what two cities are actually doing, and we explore variation in violence prevention approach by neighborhood and by neighborhood characteristics. Next. Our first question is, what types of violence prevention interventions cluster together in space and time in Cleveland and Detroit? We then explore the degree to which crime type and frequency, neighborhood racial composition, and the other factors listed here are associated with each class of violence prevention interventions. This is a work in progress, and we have thus far focused on Cleveland. We began by defining the universe of violence prevention approaches of interest, and these are construed very broadly following a technical package from the CDC and other well-recognized sources. Violence prevention approaches include everything from early childhood education, the demolition of dilapidated buildings, traditional policing approaches, community-based violence prevention interventions, and many others. We identified programs that match these categories in Cleveland, along with some additional details using document review, a survey, and key informant interviews. And our next step is to class these approaches using latent class analysis and map classes to neighborhoods. And then finally, we'll test associations with the neighborhood measures listed above. Next slide. To date, we have mapped interventions for 3 violence prevention categories in Cleveland, Ohio. Though I must state, we're going to relax our requirement that programs must be free for everyone eligible. So we'll be adding substantially to the current maps. The mapped categories include programs that pair youth with caring adults who provide mentorship, early childhood education programs, and counseling or therapy for victims of violence and those at elevated risk for perpetrating violence. And you can see here patterns are already beginning to develop. Early child education, and to a lesser degree, therapeutic care and counseling are more focused in the downtown areas of Cleveland, whereas the caring adults programs are more dispersed and in the outer areas of the city. Next. You can begin to compare service locations to locations of violent crimes involving firearms. Next. To demographic information of neighborhoods, and we'll be doing other variables of interest as well. Next. Understanding the types of violence prevention approaches that are actually in use is critical to identifying where there may be gaps in services or gaps in specific types of services, and where there may be over-reliance on one form of prevention or another. This study also highlights all the positive violence prevention work that's underway in a city that often goes unrecognized. And it's helpful to make the national conversation about how we should prevent violence more concrete by grounding it in a specific and detailed picture of what is actually happening. So I just want to end by thanking our funder, the Centers for Disease Control, and to my co-authors listed here, and to the FACTS Consortium for organizing this symposium.
Hi, my name is Uzair. I'm here to present an abstract for looking at area deprivation index as a predictor for gun violence. The question is the ADI a good predictor for gun violence? Next slide, please. The ADI is a measure of social determinant that has been validated. It was developed by the Health Resources Service Administration over 3 decades ago and has since been refined, adapted, and validated into census block group neighborhood levels by Dr. Amy Kind and her research team at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they've made this data publicly available on their website for the entirety of the United States. With the newfound interest in interventions for gun violence and all the increases in gun violence incidents, we wanted to see how we could better target interventions. So we are designing a cross-sectional study to identify populations at most risk for gun violence in Muskegon County. And we want to look at the populations between 2015 and 2021 and the incidence of gun violence and correlate that with the ADI. Next slide, please. So we'll do this by accessing the EMS biospatial data management system and creating a heat map of the point of locations for the injuries. If that is unavailable, we'll use the patient's home address, and we will correlate this with the area deprivation index and determine odds ratios to see the prevalence for gun violence based off the ADI. Next slide, please. So the ADI was useful because it involves block groups, which are the smallest geographical designation that the Census Bureau uses for collecting its data, and otherwise has been studied with many different health-related outcomes such as diabetes, cardiovascular health, early death. And we wanted to see how this would be able to help inform gun prevention policy. If such a correlation does exist, I think this would be a good model to base other gun prevention interventions off of, both at the local level and at the national level. Thank you.
Wow, what a tremendous set of presentations. I want to just start by thanking Lynn, Serena, and Sonia, and anyone else who's behind the scenes making this run so smoothly for us to be able to have these great presentations and discussion. So we now have about 10 or 11 minutes for questions. I'd like to ask all presenters, please turn your video back on so we can see everyone. Fantastic. So we do have 2 questions that we received in the Q&A, and I'd like to encourage other folks to start sending all your questions in now, because these were some great presentations. I'd like to start with a question from Megan Ranney asking for a little more overview on what the bystander intervention consists of and why that was selected for this study. Tess?
Yeah, so our bystander interventions are made up of multiple parts. So training participants to be able to recognize situations where intervention is appropriate, to discussing responsibility of bystanders to intervene, 3, discussing any barriers or obstacles to intervention, and then finally, discussing the different types of action available to have the maximum impact without putting the person who's intervening at any unnecessary risk. And one of the things that we are really emphasizing in our intervention is just the myriad of ways that there are to intervene when identifying risk situations. And I think some of the advantages of using a bystander intervention is shifting the focus away from trying to help audience members or teens who might not see themselves at risk in that moment, but to be able to produce like a classroom full of potential interveners in future problems. We also think that by addressing the adult and teen community, 4-H community as potential interveners rather than potential perpetrators of risky behavior, we're hoping that the program may face less resistance. And then also just with adolescents, we found that, there are studies showing that adolescents are often engaging in risky behavior in the presence of their same age peers. And so bystander intervention may be particularly successful within a population such as teenagers.
Thanks for that great overview, Tess. Christopher Schenk has a question for our Colorado and Washington State colleagues who did the series of talks. And he's wondering, is there existing data on what proportion of individuals who keep firearms visit firearm retailers? He's thinking of individuals who inherit firearms or purchase them online, and if they may have additional barriers to temporarily storing a firearm with a retailer.
I'll take the first stab at that. I think that it's difficult to say how many firearm owners got their firearms in what way, in particular in our states where there's very limited data on what firearms are around or who owns them. I do think it's also fair to say that firearm owners, as he was pointing out, aren't monolithic. And one of the things that we've talked about sort of qualitatively within our group and things that we'll be describing as we move forward are some of these differences with respect to sort of connection to the firearm owning community and differences between various sort of subgroups of firearm owners and then the firearm retailers themselves. There are some types of firearm retailers that are less apt to take part in one of these programs than others. Anecdotally speaking, I would say that the bigger firearm retailers are not apt to, if only because they can't sort of policy-wise get something into place. Whereas smaller, sort of mom and pop kind of operations, a lot of them that we've talked to at least, were enthusiastic about the idea of sort of providing that service to their client base and their community. They at least ones that are interested in the idea of suicide prevention writ large would like to be involved in that, at least as it pertains to the people who they interact with.
And to continue on from that, thank you, Chris. It's important to note that some of the stores that we spoke with were also ranges and were also gunsmiths. And so there were, a number of services that anyone could have, used these firearm stores for, kind of that multiple points of contact and understanding that people might be seeking these places out for different reasons and building relationships for different reasons. That's also part of the significance of having a map available for people to seek, even if they themselves don't have a relationship with a store near them right then. The idea that they can look and see where in their area that they might be able to go for these services anyway is also important.
Fantastic. All right, let's jump to a next question. So this question is for Amanda Abel. I'm so glad to see concepts from behavioral economics represented in that first presentation that you shared. And I'm curious if you might be able to share a little bit more about kind of theoretically what made you anchor on optimism bias, if there are any other concepts from behavioral economics that you're interested in exploring in future work.
Yeah, so I think this is just a new area of study in terms of firearm violence prevention research. As I mentioned, optimism bias has been observed for other health risk behaviors like talking on the phone while driving or the risks of getting lung cancer and smoking. But it hasn't really been observed for firearm related risks. So in addition to the questions that I presented about on household firearm ownership, we also asked about people's perceptions of the risks of carrying firearms and compared their perceptions of the safety associated with themselves carrying firearms versus everyone who's legally allowed to carry firearms, carrying firearms in their neighborhood. And for that, we found less evidence of optimism bias there. People tended to perceive firearm carrying as being less safe overall than just having a firearm in the home. But still, I think about 15% of respondents there showed some optimism bias in thinking that, well, it's safer if I carry, but not if everyone is carrying. So we want to dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see you exploring this. Actually, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but Katie Hoskins, who's on this call, has a great piece in Pediatrics kind of talking through some of the different constructs that I think could bear a lot of fruit as we think, just like you did with optimism bias. So I think this is a really open and rich area, and I'm really glad that you featured that work, Amanda. The next question I would like to ask is for Greg. So it was really interesting to see your results. Thanks for sharing them. Public art is a bit of a broad category. And I'm also thinking about some of the great work from Gina South on greening. And I'm wondering if different types of artwork might have different associations with community violence, and also how that might interplay with if that artwork also has any kind of nature themes built into it.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So in identifying our like initial sample of public artworks, we did take like a very broad definition in terms of like what is public artwork. So it's a lot of murals, but there's other stuff in there as well. And so looking at kind of how the medium of the artwork is associated with violence is definitely something that we want to do, because I'm thinking that maybe we would expect artworks that are sort of like landscape architecture or that deal with like lighting installations. Those may work really similar to other kinds of like SEPTED or crime prevention through environmental design interventions that address kind of physical space or that address lighting conditions. But then for things like murals, it may really come down to like the message of the mural or whether or not there was community engagement in the creation of it. So yeah, that's definitely something that we're hoping to look at going forward.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask Katie to answer a question related to this idea of parents as end users of the intervention. Can you speak a little bit more about how you conceptualize that in your work?
Yeah, thank you, Renette. So in terms of thinking about like principles of user-centered design, it's an approach that grounds intervention, redesign, or refinement in information about people who ultimately will use the intervention, with this emphasis on usability and context. So thinking about the context in which the intervention is actually being deployed. So in our work, pediatric primary care, and collaboration during that adaptation allows designers to then align specific program components with end users' needs and preferences. So in our work, thinking about end users being parents, both firearm owning parents as well as non-owning parents as well. So really thinking about that end user from the beginning in terms of making refinements to an intervention with an emphasis on where it's actually going to be used.
Thanks. And I love seeing those implementation science constructs well represented. So we are now at a place where I'm going to wrap us up. So I want to give everybody a huge round of applause. I wish we were together so you could hear the applause, but it's happening. I want to thank everyone for joining us.